They say revenge is a sin. But what if revenge is the only way a soul trapped in hell remembers it was once human? Listen closely, because this story was never meant to reach your ears. It was buried beneath 170 years of silence, sealed behind the decaying walls of a New Orleans mansion that once dripped with sugar, blood, and secrets. The official records called it a fever. But those who saw the bodies, 13 of them, each one choking on their final scream, knew better. It wasn't disease, it was design. The year was 1847. The Garden District was a cathedral of hypocrisy. Beneath chandeliers that sparkled like heaven's mercy, the city's aristocrats drank brandy over the bodies of the enslaved who built their empires. And in one of those mansions, a woman named Violet, born a slave, trained as a cook and broken by cruelty, fed her masters something they had never tasted before. Not gumbo, not praline pudding. But here's what they never told you: Violet didn't act alone. The whispers in the slave quarters spoke of a covenant older than the plantations, older than New Orleans itself. A code passed from mother to daughter in secret, written in herbs and shadows, a ritual that turned kitchens into temples and recipes into weapons. This isn't just a murder story. It's a revelation, a story of what happens when the oppressed stops asking for mercy and starts learning how to strike back. Patiently, invisibly, perfectly. You've been taught to fear evil, but sometimes evil wears a powdered wig and dines beneath crystal light. Sometimes the devil isn't the one who kills. It's the one who endures, until she learns how to make poison taste like justice. If you're still listening, you've already crossed a threshold most men avoid, because the deeper you go into Violet's kitchen, the more you'll see yourself in her. The hunger, the silence, the rage. And once you understand what she did that night, once you feel it, you can't go back. The truth about Violet isn't in the archives. It's in what they tried to erase. And tonight, we're going to bring it back from the dead. New Orleans in 1847 was a city built on illusion, perfume covering rot, civility masking cruelty. The Bogart mansion stood at its center like a temple of power, 3 stories of white marble paid for by sugar and blood. By day, its balconies shimmered with the laughter of the elite. But by night, the walls whispered. Every soul inside that house knew who held the whip, and who tasted its sting. Violet had lived her entire life within those walls, never as a guest, only as a shadow. She was born in the mansion's kitchen, the daughter of a cook who died at her post. She inherited her mother's recipes, her skill, and her servitude. The Bogarts praised her food in public, but spat at her in private. She fed them life, while starving for her own. And that's how they liked it, because control tastes sweetest when the victim smiles while serving. Octave Bogart, the master of the house, believed himself a god. He decided who ate who blood, who breathed. His wife Celeste hid her terror behind lace and jewels. His children mimicked his cruelty, and his slaves. They learned silence, the kind of silence that eats through your soul like rust. But Violet, she was different. She obeyed, but her obedience had a pulse. Her eyes carried something dangerous, something waiting. Every Sunday, she served them a feast that was more ritual than meal. Golden meats, shimmering sauces, and praline pudding that could make grown men weep. The guests adored her. They said her hands were blessed. But they never realized what kind of spirit guided those hands. Violet didn't just cook food. She read people. She understood appetite, vanity, and weakness. She watched her masters closely, not with fear, but with study. Every insult, every slap, every command became an ingredient. The Bogarts believed Violet's silence was submission, but it wasn't. It was strategy. Because a woman who cannot speak learns to listen. And when you listen long enough, you learn where to strike. That was Violet's true education. Not from books, but from pain. Each humiliation sharpened her will until her heart became colder than the marble floors she scrubbed. And when Octave's whip found the man she loved, Something inside her snapped. Quietly, cleanly, like a knife leaving its sheath. That was the night the poison began to brew. The night Samuel was whipped beneath the courtyard moon. Something ancient awoke inside Violet. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. Anger burns fast. But what Violet felt that night was slower, colder, like water finding every crack in a stone until it breaks. She watched Octave's whip draw blood from the man she loved, watched him collapse into the dirt, his breath leaving him in wet, broken gasps. Around them, no one moved. The slaves looked away. The family watched from the balcony as if it were theater. Violet understood, in that single moment, that no one was coming to save her. Not God, not justice, only her. When Octave turned that whip toward her, something inside Violet didn't shatter. It aligned. Pain stripped away fear, leaving only focus. Her body bowed, her lips trembled, but her mind was already elsewhere, far from the courtyard, deep inside the kitchen where she had always held dominion. The kitchen was her realm, the only space Octave could not fully control. He could command her to cook, but he could not feel what she felt as she mixed the herbs, measured the spice, and stirred the pot. That was her altar, her battlefield, her weapon. That night, as she cleaned Samuel's blood from the floor, she made her decision, not out of rage, but balance. Violet believed in balance. Nature demanded it. Life feeds on death. The rich fed on the poor. The powerful fed on the powerless. But one day, the powerless would learn to feed back. And when they did, it would not be with blades or fire. It would be with patience. Precision, knowledge. She would not scream. She would not curse. She would simply cook. She began collecting things no one noticed. Herbs from the garden, roots from the marsh. A small vial she kept hidden in the folds of her skirt. She listened to the old ones speak of plants that healed, and those that punished. She studied their effects quietly, testing drop by drop, until she found the perfect balance between bitterness and sweetness. Death disguised as flavor. By dawn, Violet had stopped being a slave. Outwardly, nothing had changed. She still bowed, still obeyed, still prepared their meals with the same perfection. But inside, she had crossed the line between survival and sovereignty. The next Sunday supper would no longer be a meal. It would be a reckoning. The mansion awoke before dawn on that final Sunday, bathed in the slow, golden light of a Louisiana summer. Cicadas sang from the oaks outside, and the Bogart family stirred with their usual arrogance, unaware that this was the last sunrise they would ever see. In the kitchen, Violet was already at work. To the untrained eye, she looked the same as always, measured, composed, obedient, but her silence carried a new rhythm. Every movement was deliberate. Every breath was part of the ritual. The wooden spoon in her hand wasn't a tool anymore. It was an extension of her will. She began by preparing the soup, a gentle simmer of vegetables and broth, comforting, innocent. Then came the roques, darkened to perfection over low flame, the same way her mother had taught her. She sprinkled in herbs so fragrant that even the kitchen maids smiled through their exhaustion. No one noticed the faint dust she added after, the powder that shimmered for a moment, before disappearing into the bubbling surface. Violet knew precisely what she was doing. She wasn't a poisoner by trade, she was something older, a student of nature's justice. The powder came from crushed seeds mixed with a root that slowed the heart. It didn't act instantly. That was the brilliance of it. It would spread warmth first, a tingling heat through the throat, a sweetness that disguised its venom. The first symptom would be laughter, the second, silence. Outside the kitchen, Octave shouted at the stable boy for a saddle left unpolished. Celeste practiced her smile before the mirror. The children giggled upstairs. None of them heard the quiet hum from Violet's lips, a melody her mother once sang when a storm was coming. By noon, the table was set with crystal and silver. Old Moses, the butler, looked at Violet for a long moment as he polished the glasses. His eyes, ancient and knowing, held no question, only understanding. He had served long enough to recognize the look of a spirit preparing for war. Without a word, he gave a single nod and turned away. Violet's hands did not tremble as she plated the food. The air itself seemed to bend around her. She was no longer the servant girl they mocked. She had become something else entirely. An instrument of divine correction. That evening, when the Bogarts gathered to dine, they would not be eating supper. They would be eating their own sins. The grand dining room glowed with candlelight, its walls lined with portraits of dead Bogarts staring down in painted judgment. The chandelier flickered, scattering fractured light across crystal goblets and polished silver. At the head of the table sat Octave Bogart, proud as ever, his presence filling the room like a toxin. Around him gathered his family, his wife Celeste in pearls, his children dressed in silk, his mother and brother conversing in hushed tones about money and pride. None of them saw the shadow moving quietly through the doorway. Violet, the invisible hand that held their fates. She served with perfect posture, as she always had. Her dress, plain and spotless. Her eyes, calm and unreadable. No tremor betrayed her thoughts. The family praised her cooking as they always did. "Perfection," said Celeste, tasting the soup. Octave nodded approvingly. "She's a born servant," he said, as though she were not standing 3 feet away. Violet bowed slightly. Inside, she smiled. They didn't notice how the flavor lingered differently that night, how the warmth in their throats spread a little slower, how the sweetness burned just slightly before fading. The poison, beautiful in its silence, was working. Conversation filled the air. Plantation profits, politics, gossip. Octave complained about lazy workers. Celeste gossiped about other women's dresses. The children laughed, innocent in cruelty. Violet stood in the corner like a statue, her gaze moving from face to face, memorizing them as one might study tombstones. After the third course, the first symptom appeared. Octave's brother August paused mid-sentence, pressing a hand to his temple. His voice faltered. Celeste asked if he was unwell. He laughed it off. Then Celeste's hand began to tremble, the wine glass shaking against her rings. Moments later, their eldest son coughed. A sharp, dry sound that echoed through the hall. Still, they ate. Still, they praised the food. Violet stepped forward to pour more wine, her face serene. Her shadow stretched across the white tablecloth, long and dark as judgment. When Octave finally looked up at her, something in his expression changed. For the first time in his life, he saw her, not as a servant, but as something vast, ancient, and unafraid. And Violet smiled, because the first drops of death had already been swallowed. The room's laughter faded into uneasy silence. It began subtly, the scrape of a fork stopping mid-motion, a chair creaking as someone shifted uncomfortably. Then came the coughs. Small at first, polite and restrained. But one by one, the Bogarts began to clutch their throats, eyes watering, hands trembling. Celeste pressed her napkin to her lips, leaving behind a faint streak of blood. Across the table, August groaned, his face turning ashen beneath the candlelight. Violet stood perfectly still, her back straight, her eyes fixed upon them. The air grew thick, heavy with the sound of choking and confusion. "Fetch the doctor," Octave roared, slamming his fist against the table, though even his voice had lost its strength. His command cracked like brittle glass in the air. The servants hesitated, their feet rooted to the floor. Old Moses didn't move. He simply bowed his head, muttering a prayer under his breath. Celeste fell first, her body convulsed, her pearls snapping and scattering like drops of light across the floor. The youngest child screamed, a sound too innocent for the horror unfolding around it. Octave stumbled to his feet, rage and fear burning in his fading eyes. What did you?" he gasped, his words dissolving into silence as the poison claimed his breath. Violet stepped closer, calm and deliberate, her voice low and steady. "I only served what you asked for, master." Octave's knees buckled. He collapsed beside his wife, his fingers clawing weakly at the tablecloth as though grasping for power one last time. His eyes met hers, pleading, desperate, human at last. Violet looked down at him, the faintest glimmer of pity flickering behind her calm expression. "The earth remembers," she whispered, "even if men forget." The children cried, their sobs echoing through the grand hall. The chandeliers swayed above, their crystals chiming softly, almost like laughter. The poison worked with eerie precision, slow enough for Violet to watch, fast enough to silence them before dawn. When the final breath left Octave's lips, the room fell utterly still. The master of the house lay dead beside the meal he had praised. Violet turned toward the window, where the first light of morning crept across the horizon. She didn't weep. She didn't smile. She simply exhaled, long and slow, as though freeing every scream she had ever swallowed. Justice had been served. Cold, quiet, and absolute. By the time the sun climbed over the cypress trees, the Bogard mansion had fallen into silence. The smell of roasted meat and wine still lingered, but beneath it hung the metallic scent of death. Flies gathered on the edges of untouched plates. The candles had burned down to wax puddles. What had been a house of arrogance now felt like a mausoleum. Violet stood in the center of the dining room, barefoot, her apron stained with sweat and broth. Around her, the family lay as if asleep. Some slumped in chairs, others collapsed to the floor. The children's small hands were still clasped together. It was the only part of the scene that made her hesitate. For a moment, her lips quivered, and she whispered a prayer under her breath, not for forgiveness, but for peace. The children, too, were born into cruelty, she thought, but she also knew the cruelty, when inherited, grows unless it's buried. She moved through the room slowly, like a priestess performing a final ritual. She closed their eyes one by one, wiped the blood from Celeste's chin, and straightened the silverware on the table. Each gesture was deliberate, reverent. Death to Violet was not vengeance anymore. It was release, from their cruelty and from her suffering. In the kitchen, old Moses waited by the doorway. His wrinkled face was pale but calm. When Violet approached, he did not speak. He simply nodded again, the same quiet acknowledgement he had given before the meal began. "They won't understand," he finally murmured, "when they come for you." Violet's eyes met his. "They never understood when they were alive," she replied softly. "Why should they start now?" He bowed his head. "Then what will you do?" She looked toward the open window. The swamp mist rolled in slow and low, wrapping around the house like a shroud. "I'll go where they can't follow," she said. "Back to the river. Back to silence." Moses handed her a small pouch. "Coins, maybe food, maybe both. Go before the sun is high," he warned. Violet stepped outside, her bare feet touching the cold earth. Behind her, the house loomed, grand, decaying, and cursed. She didn't look back. The air was thick with heat and justice, and as she disappeared into the morning fog, the mansion exhaled for the first time in decades. The Bogards were gone, and Violet was finally free. By noon, word of the Bogard family's mysterious death had spread like wildfire across New Orleans. The news traveled first through whispers among the slaves, then through the hushed tones of merchants and carriage drivers. By dusk, it had reached the parlors of the rich, who spoke of it with trembling fascination over their brandy glasses. "Poison," they murmured, "all of them gone." The details changed with each retelling. Some said it was bad meat, others claimed witchcraft. But every version ended the same way, with the name Violet. The authorities arrived at the mansion 2 days later. They found the bodies bloated and stiff, flies buzzing around the remains of the grand feast. The silverware still gleamed. The soup bowls sat half full, their contents congealed into a dark, oily sheen. But of Violet, there was no trace. The servants swore they hadn't seen her since the night of the supper. Some said she vanished into the swamp before sunrise. Others whispered that she walked straight into the bayou and never came out. The newspapers called it the Bogard poisoning. The white men wrote of a mad kitchen girl who had lost her wits after years of servitude. The preachers called her a devil's bride, a creature of vengeance sent to punish sin. But among the enslaved, her story became something else entirely. Around campfires and in whispered songs, Violet became La Main Noire, the black hand of justice. They said her spirit wandered the riverbanks at night, her apron stained red, her eyes bright as moonlight. Those who treated their servants cruelly would hear her humming in the dark. Mothers told their children her tale not as a warning, but as a promise. A story of a woman who refused to die quietly, who turned her chains into power. The old women spoke her name with reverence, mixing it with prayer, and though the white masters tried to erase her from record, her legend grew stronger with every retelling. Years later, travelers swore that on humid summer nights, a faint singing could be heard near the Bogard ruins, a melody soft and sorrowful, carried by the wind. They said it was Violet, still stirring her pot beneath the moonlight, still watching, still waiting, because vengeance may die with the body, but justice, once awakened, never sleeps. In the years that followed, the Bogard mansion decayed slowly, as though time itself refused to touch it too gently. Vines crawled up the white columns, the windows shattered, and the once grand dining hall became a graveyard of rotted wood and broken glass. The town avoided it. Children dared each other to step onto the porch, but never stayed long. Locals swore that the air near the house grew colder, even in the sweltering Louisiana heat. The brave, or the foolish, claimed they could still smell stew simmering in the air, sweet and sharp, like memory itself refusing to die. Violet's name lived on in whispers. In New Orleans, her legend evolved into ghost tales told at midnight gatherings. Riverboat captains said they saw a woman in a white apron walking along the levee, her bare feet leaving no prints in the mud. Market women spoke of her spirit appearing behind cruel mistresses, whispering words that made their milk curdle and their husbands fall ill. To some, she was a guardian of the oppressed. To others, a restless soul still searching for peace. The church denounced her memory, calling her the devil's cook. Yet even the priests crossed themselves when her name was spoken after dark. They knew the swamp did not easily release its dead. As the city changed, through war, freedom, and the slow burn of time, Violet's story became something larger than vengeance. Her name was stitched into songs sung by freedwomen washing clothes along the riverbanks. Her story was painted in murals hidden behind taverns, carved into the wood of shanty doors, and whispered in prayers for protection. Violet had become a symbol, not of murder, but of reckoning. Old Moses lived long enough to see the world shift. He never spoke publicly of that night, but when asked about Violet, he would close his eyes and say, "She cooked the truth, that's all." And so the Bogard estate remained, a monument to cruelty, reclaimed by the swamp. The moss hung low like mourning veils. Frogs croaked in the flooded courtyard, and when the moon was full, travelers passing by could hear it again, the low, rhythmic sound of a wooden spoon striking a pot. 3 beats, a pause, 3 more, as if Violet was still there, stirring the past, keeping the flame of her justice alive. By the dawn of the 20th century, Violet's story had become inseparable from the soul of New Orleans itself. Tour guides began to whisper tale to wide-eyed visitors, pointing toward the distant ruins of the Bogard estate. The swamp had nearly swallowed the house whole by then. Its roof collapsed, its marble floors cracked, its dining room overtaken by roots and moss. But the legend remained alive, breathing through every brick and broken window. Locals said that when the wind shifted from the bayou, you could still hear her humming, a tune that made the cypress trees shiver. The city had changed. Slavery was gone, yet the scars of cruelty lingered like ghosts. People found comfort in Violet's myth. To the poor, She was justice made flesh, a spirit who punished the wicked when the law refused. To others, she was a warning that no cruelty went unanswered, no evil forgotten. Women of color began leaving offerings near the edge of the swamp, bowls of rice, small coins, sometimes spoons carved from wood. They called it feeding Violet, a ritual meant to ask for strength, protection, or courage to face the world that had always been cruel to them. Children grew up hearing her name in lullabies, softened into half-remembered rhyme. Don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat the meek. Violet walks where the wicked sleep. It became both prayer and threat. Even those who didn't believe in ghosts refused to eat stew cooked by strangers on stormy nights. As decades passed, her legend spread beyond the swamp. Folklorists wrote about her. Blues singers wove her story into sorrowful songs. Artists painted her eyes in murals, dark, unblinking, filled with quiet power. Some called her a murderer. Others called her a saint. But everyone, no matter what they believed, spoke her name with respect. And yet, some nights, especially in late summer when the humidity pressed against the soul, something deeper stirred in the air. Those who lingered too long near the boggart ruins swore they saw a flicker of light inside, like a lantern swaying gently. Some claimed they smelled onions and herbs, faint and warm. And if they listened closely, over the hum of the cicadas and the croak of the frogs, they heard her voice again, soft, haunting, eternal. Justice don't die. It just learns to cook slow. By the 1920s, Violet's legend had transformed into something that pulsed through the heart of New Orleans like music. Jazz musicians in smoky clubs along Basin Street sang of her between sets, their trumpets crying her grief in brass and blue. Violet's song, they called it, a slow, mournful melody said to make candles flicker when played after midnight. Her story no longer belonged to the past. It had become rhythm, breath, heartbeat. Writers and poets turned her vengeance into verse, painting her as both sinner and savior. Painters captured her eyes, half fire, half mercy, on the peeling walls of back alley taverns. The people loved her not because she was good, but because she was real. Violet's rage had been the rage of every woman beaten and silenced, every soul forced to bow. Her defiance became an anthem whispered beneath the hum of daily life. Tourists came seeking her ghost. Some swore they saw her reflection in the muddy water near the boggart ruins. Others claimed to feel her hand brush against their shoulder as they crossed the Bayou Bridge. But for the people who had inherited her blood and her story, Violet was no ghost. She was presence, a quiet guardian, a reminder that the powerless could become the storm. In the French Quarter, old women began cooking a stew each year on the anniversary of the boggart deaths. They called it Violet's Feast. No one ate it. It was left outside overnight in a clay pot, steaming beneath the moon. In the morning, it would be gone, either eaten by the stray dogs or taken by something unseen. Let her eat, the women would say, crossing themselves. Let her rest. But rest was never Violet's way. Stories grew of cruel men found dead near the swamps. Hearts stopped, faces frozen in terror. Some said it was snakes. Others whispered it was her. And though no one ever proved it, the people believed, because belief was her immortality. She had stopped being a woman long ago. She had become a shadow stitched into the soul of New Orleans. A hymn sung through rain, a warning in the dark. And so, as the city danced and burned and rebuilt itself, Violet's legend endured. Proof that even the forgotten could leave scars deep enough for eternity to remember. By the late 20th century, Violet had crossed the boundary between myth and memory. Her story was no longer whispered. It was marketed. Ghost tour guides in pressed linen shirts led visitors through the French Quarter with lanterns raised, stopping in front of crumbling mansions as the night air swirled with jazz and cigarette smoke. They say she poisoned them all. They denounced dramatically, the tourists leaning in close. Violet, the kitchen slave who served her vengeance hot. Cameras flashed. The crowd gasped, but what the guides didn't know, or pretended not to, was that the people who truly believed in Violet didn't tell her story for entertainment. They told it as a form of truth. In the poorer neighborhoods, where the old oaks still stood heavy with moss, Violet remained sacred. Women lit candles beside their stoves and whispered her name when life became unbearable. The elderly spoke of her as though she had been a friend. "Violet don't forgive," they'd murmur, "but she remembers who deserves her grace." Some claimed that when injustice struck, a landlord's cruelty, a police beating, a hungry child's cry, they'd wake at night to the sound of a spoon stirring in a pot. It meant Violet was near, watching, listening. Artists resurrected her in murals and plays. In smoky bars, musicians invoked her before performing songs of defiance. Feminist poets called her the first Queen of Vengeance. Academics studied her story as part of Louisiana folklore, though none could agree whether she had truly existed. But for those who carried her in their hearts, the question of existence didn't matter. Legends, they'd say, don't need proof. They just need purpose. Yet even in her sanctification, Violet's ghost remained restless. Travelers who ventured too close to the Bogard ruins told of strange happenings, footsteps echoing on waterlogged floors, whispers rising from the reeds, the scent of stew drifting on windless nights. One woman swore she saw a figure by the window, dark-skinned, head bowed, stirring a pot that glowed faintly with light. When she looked again, the figure was gone. But the pot kept stirring, and somewhere in the distance, faint yet unmistakable, a voice hummed an old plantation song, soft, steady, eternal. Because Violet's vengeance had never been about death. It had always been about remembrance. In present-day New Orleans, the city pulsed with life, music spilling from every corner, laughter echoing through the streets, and the humid air thick with memory. But beneath the rhythm of the brass bands and the glitter of Bourbon Street, the old spirit still lingered. The Bogard ruins, now little more than a cracked foundation buried in ivy, had become a quiet shrine for those who knew where to look. Locals said the swamp never fully reclaimed that place because something within it refused to rest. One of those who felt the pull was Amara Lewis, a young chef born and raised in Treme. Her grandmother had always spoken of Violet, the woman who cooked justice into her stew. Amara had grown up hearing that story every Sunday, her grandmother's voice low and reverent. "She wasn't evil, baby," she'd say. "She was balance." Now, years later, Amara found herself haunted by that same legend as she prepared to open her first restaurant, a small Creole eatery she called La Main Noire, the Black Hand. From the beginning, strange things happened in her kitchen. Pots would rattle without reason. The scent of herbs would fill the air before she lit the stove. Once, while testing a gumbo recipe, she heard humming, a woman's voice, soft and low, carrying a tune she somehow recognized though she'd never heard it before. The hairs on her neck stood on end, but she didn't feel afraid. She felt watched, protected. That night, Amara dreamed of a woman in a white apron standing by a wooden table, stirring a pot under moonlight. Her face was calm, her eyes deep and knowing. "Cook the truth," the woman whispered, "and feed it to the world." When Amara woke, her recipe book lay open on the counter, a single sentence written across the page, in her grandmother's handwriting: "Justice is best served slow." The restaurant opened a month later. Critics praised the food's depth of flavor, rich, bold, impossible to describe. But the locals, especially the elders, said it tasted like memory, like something old and holy had been stirred back to life. And that night, when Amara closed up alone, the air filled with a faint hum. Violet's hum. The past had awakened, and this time it had found a voice. As La Main Noire gained attention, whispers began to follow Amara wherever she went. Customers said her food healed something inside them. Pain they couldn't name, grief they thought long buried. A veteran claimed one bowl of gumbo had quieted his nightmares. A widow swore she saw her late husband's smile reflected in the restaurant window after finishing a meal. But for Amara, the changes were far more personal. Each night she cooked, she felt Violet's presence stronger, closer, as if her ancestor's spirit moved through her hands, guiding every motion. It started subtly. A flicker in the corner of her eye, a shadow that stayed when the lights were off. Then came the voice, not a whisper this time, but clear, commanding, older than the city itself. Truth doesn't beg for belief, child. It burns through denial like fire through silk. Amara froze in the kitchen, the wooden spoon trembling in her grasp. Her grandmother's stories had never prepared her for this. That night, she went home and dug through her grandmother's old chest, searching for answers. Beneath faded photographs and prayer cards, she found a small leather-bound book, its pages brittle with age. On the first page, in faded ink, were the words Violet. 1823-1847. My hands fed monsters. My heart fed fire. Amara turned the pages, reading Violet's confessions written in the months before the massacre. Each line was a slow descent into madness, or awakening. Violet spoke of herbs chosen not for flavor but for power, of roots that whispered when crushed, of a holy vengeance that came to her in dreams, telling her that liberation must first taste like death. Halfway through the journal, the ink shifted color, from brown to deep crimson. Violet's handwriting grew erratic. He took my love and called it sin. He took my hunger and called it rebellion. I will take his breath and call it justice. Amara's pulse quickened. She realized Violet hadn't been alone in her vengeance. She had invoked something ancient, something older than New Orleans itself. The recipe for the fatal supper wasn't just culinary. It was ritual. As thunder rolled over the city that night, Amara felt the kitchen tremble. The lights flickered, and from the darkness came that same voice again, firm and final. It's your turn now. The storm over New Orleans raged like a living thing. Rain hammered against the windows of Le Main Noir, thunder rolled like drums of war, and in the heart of the kitchen, under the dim glow of a single flickering bulb, Amara stood before the stove, clutching Violet's journal. The pages fluttered open to a final entry, one written the night before the Bogard family's last supper. It wasn't a recipe. It was an invocation, a spell disguised as a feast. Each ingredient had been chosen for more than flavor. It was symbolic, coded rebellion wrapped in tradition, bay leaves for protection, rue for remembrance, bloodroot for vengeance. Even the sugar, that symbol of the Bogards' wealth, had been transformed from the tool of oppression into the medium of their undoing. Violet hadn't just fed them death. She had fed them their own sins, refined and served back to them as dessert. As lightning illuminated the kitchen, Amara felt a heat rise from the floorboards. The journal trembled in her hands. She could smell the faint scent of praline and smoke. Then, she heard it again. Violet's voice. History doesn't end, child. It waits for the brave to finish it. Her reflection in the window began to shift. For a split second, another woman stood in her place. Dark-skinned, eyes fierce, apron soaked with sweat and tears. Violet stared back at her, silent but commanding. Amara's hands moved without thought. She began to cook, not for customers, not for critics, but for the dead. She followed the ritual exactly as Violet had written it, feeling her heartbeat sink with the rhythm of the rain. When the pot began to boil, the air shimmered. She whispered the final line from the journal, "By fire, by hunger, by blood, may justice be fed once more." The storm went silent. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then a surge of energy exploded through the room. Every light in the building flared white. The scent of sugar and smoke filled the air, and when the silence finally returned, the words appeared on the condensation of the window pane. Slowly forming from the mist, "She is awake." And Amara fell to her knees. She understood. Violet's revenge was never about poison. It was about awakening, the reclaiming of power buried beneath centuries of silence. The kitchen had become an altar, and Amara was now its priestess.